Again, welcome to the webinar on raising awareness and combating human trafficking on today, World Day Against Trafficking of Persons. My name is Felisa Tibbetts, and I'm Director of Human Rights Education Associates, HREA, which is sponsoring this webinar. HREA was founded in 1996 and is a non-governmental organization that supports education, training, and capacity building of rights holders in claiming their rights and duty bearers in fulfilling their human rights obligations. We are truly honored to be able to welcome two very well-known and reputable individuals from two organizations heavily engaged in preventing human trafficking and working with the survivors of human trafficking. The organizations are Fair Girls and the Human Trafficking Legal Center. And I will be presenting our speakers in just a moment. I first wanted to give you an idea about our program for today. So after I introduce our speakers, they will each have about 15 minutes to present on the work of their organizations. We'll then have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you do have questions, please make a note of them. We'll have a period, about 15 minutes, where you can interchange with the speakers. And in the final 10 minutes of this webinar, we're actually going to be focusing on education and training. What can we as educators or as learners do to try to prevent human trafficking, to try and raise awareness about it? So this will be the main focus. Our speakers will address this, and also Serena Yamahata, our HREA intern who's organized this webinar, many thanks Serena, will be sharing with you some resources that we've identified that you might want to take into account and consider using for your own work. So that's the agenda for today. We are recording, so please bear that in mind. If you would prefer not to have your image, then you can keep your image off. We are going to be recording. Also, if you have, since you pre-registered, just so you know, I'm planning to add you to the HREA listserv. We have about one message a week going out related to human rights education. If you are not interested to be added to this listserv, you can either opt out by writing your name in the chat box, or you can unsubscribe later. But I just wanted to give you a heads up that we're planning to add you to our network. All right, with that, I would like to first of all, again, thank the speakers, Kimberly Crawford and Martina Vandenberg, for joining us today. And in admiration, and also to express my admiration and our collective admiration, HRA interns, for your amazing work. So Kimberly Crawford of Fair Girls, who will be our first speaker, is the prevention, education, and outreach specialist at this organization. She's a graduate of the University of Maryland with a BA in psychology and criminal justice, and she had a minor in Spanish language, culture, and professional contexts. She works to provide prevention education to at-risk youths in the capital region and trauma-informed training with community-based organizations, government agencies, and law enforcement who interact with potential victims and survivors of trafficking. So excited that you're here, Kimberly, and to hear what kind of education and capacity building strategies you're using in these with these target audiences. Martina Vandenberg is the founder and president of the Human Trafficking Legal Center, an organization dedicated to providing pro bono counsel to trafficking survivors. Vandenberg has spent more than 2 decades fighting human trafficking, forced labor, rape as a war crime, and violence against women. She has trained more than 4,000 pro bono attorneys nationwide to handle human trafficking matters. As a former Human Rights Watch researcher, Vandenberg spearheaded investigations into human rights violations in the Russian Federation, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Uzbekistan, Kosovo, Israel, and Ukraine. Fantastic work with both these ladies. I'd now like to turn the floor over to Kimberly, and warm thank you to both Kimberly and Martina for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen and give you guys a little presentation. Just want to make sure everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, great. So hi, everybody. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I am Kimberly Crawford. I'm the Prevention Education and Outreach Specialist at Fair Girls. And Fair Girls is an anti-human trafficking nonprofit organization. We are based in Washington, D.C. And our mission is to end human trafficking one life at a time through survivor-centered and trauma-informed services, prevention, and advocacy. So a little bit about what is Fair Girls. We provide intervention and holistic care to survivors of human trafficking and CSEC, which is the commercial sexual exploitation of children, who identify as girls or young women. Through prevention education and policy advocacy, Fair Girls also works to eradicate human trafficking and create better outcomes for survivors. Some of the services that we provide are really capitalized on our holistic approach. So we offer case management, and our case management services are extremely broad and represent an incredibly wide range of potential clients because we offer crisis response. We do have a 24/7, 365 crisis hotline that anyone can call, whether they are looking to make a self-referral or a referral of another potential victim that they might know. And that is operated by our direct services team. So any time of day, any day of the week, someone will answer. And we pride ourselves in a quick turnaround when it comes to case management, meaning that within 24 to 48 hours, someone should receive feedback from us. Our Hope Court program is a new program that we've started with DC Superior Court, and that allows us to really focus on early intervention of youth that are currently involved in the juvenile justice system. And so these youth clients are at an enormous risk of trafficking and other potential victimization. So having that early intervention is incredibly important. And Hope Court really focuses on maintaining education and community-based activities for youth to get involved in so that they're not left, twiddling their thumbs and ending up in bad situations. We have a very wide and expansive partnership with law enforcement, not only in the Capital Region, but also in Northern Virginia, Montgomery County, Maryland, and Prince George's County, Maryland. And in that partnership, it really helps our referral network because law enforcement trusts us as an organization to provide holistic services. And they make referrals of potential victims that they encounter on a daily basis. Our partnerships with other community-based organizations and government agencies allow us to not only secure adequate funding to provide the services that we provide, but also referral pathways for potential clients that we may not be able to service, but can allow them to receive help elsewhere. In our drop-in center is a confidential location that survivors can go to work on their personal goals, whether that may be workforce development or educational goals that they have. We provide them with resources, computers, books, and even clothing and hygienic products to be able to meet those goals. Our prevention education program is something that I spearhead, and that involves numerous prevention education curriculum for at-risk youth, starting from grade 3. And so that is our Tell Your Friends curriculum. It is one that we have entirely formulated and made as appealable as possible to youth who range in an age from grade 3 all the way up to grade 9. And we update this on a regular basis to make it as engaging as possible for the youth. Our HT 101 is a community-based curriculum that we share with community organizations, law enforcement, and other nonprofits in the area. And this we do offer in a wide range of levels. We have HT 101, 201, and 301. And it really depends on the knowledge level of the organization requesting the training. In terms of outreach, we like to attend as many community events as possible. Given COVID, this of course was not something that we were able to do in the last year, but now we are starting to get back out there and maintaining a presence in the community, which, as we know, is very important for building and maintaining rapport with clientele. And our street outreach program is a very robust program in partnership with Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. And in this program, we operate during peak hours of sex work, given the research done in the area that we serve. And we're able to offer women resources such to fill their hygienic needs and offer them resources about our crisis line and other organizations that can help them with meeting their needs in terms of housing, legal services, mental health, and also case management. Our Vita Home is an emergency and transitional housing program. It is the only safe house of its kind in the capital region, and it offers a safety net for survivors to take the time that they need to work on themselves and take the action in terms of legal services and mental health to better themselves and transition back into society and to really help themselves grow. And that's something that I really like about Fair Girls, is that we really see victims from point A all the way to point B. And it really does show the importance of holistic services and being able to provide as much wraparound as possible. And in terms of eradicating human trafficking, we work to do this through policy advocacy. And it's really important to note that our policy advocacy is rooted in the lived experiences of survivors. So with that being said, we support vehicular policies, the Safe Harbor Act in Washington, D.C. that was recently passed, and policies pertaining to access to housing. So the reason we provide such holistic services is because human trafficking is one of, if not the most complex organized crime in this country. So what does that mean federally? The federal definition is that human trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to recruit, harbor, transport, provide, or obtain any person for labor or commercial sex, or to cause a person under the age of 18 to engage in a commercial sex act, even if force, fraud, or coercion aren't used. And I really like to stress that point because no one under the age of 18 can consent to consensual sex work. So there is no need for force, fraud, or coercion. It is automatically considered the trafficking of a minor and CSEC if they are under the age of 18. And in terms of Fair Girls and the services that we provide, the most common form of trafficking that we see is domestic sex trafficking. And that can fall under many different categories. There are many different types of domestic sex trafficking, but we work specifically with female identifying survivors who have a vast age range, anywhere from age 12 to age 26. And it's notable to say that the average age of entry into trafficking is 19. So its complexity comes from a variety of origins, and these are listed here as the drivers of trafficking. So we know that poverty is a huge driver because when people don't have the means to create their own opportunities and meet their needs, they will find alternative ways. And that is a huge vulnerability to enter into the life of human trafficking. Promises of a better life. We see this mostly with labor trafficking. And while that is not a sector of trafficking that Fair Girls works with on a regular basis, it's still necessary to raise awareness for the issue because it is actually the majority of trafficking cases, at least in the United States. I believe the most recent statistic said that labor trafficking represented 66% of all trafficking in the country. Organized crime. So we know that the two most well-known organized crimes are the drug trade and human trafficking. And lately, especially given the pandemic, we've seen a rise of human trafficking, one that honestly could rival that of the drug trade in the near future. Violence and discrimination against women and children. We know that human trafficking is a crime that is disproportionate amongst women, and the victimization is incredibly higher for women of minority communities and those who identify as LGBTQ+. And finally, political unrest and armed conflict. So being located in our nation's capital, political unrest and armed conflict is something that is uniquely relevant for my organization because, for example, the events of earlier this year on January 6th, for those of you who don't know, that was the date of the Capitol riots. And since that date, there has been a huge influx of law enforcement presence in the capital region. And this has dramatically shifted human trafficking trends and peak timing of sex work because of that increased police presence. So it's become increasingly harder for my organization to reach out to women because they've seemingly gone underground. And this is especially true for our street outreach program. Peak hours were typically 4 to 8 a.m. or 10 p.m. to 2 in the morning. However, we've noticed on recent street outreach endeavors that this time has clearly changed because we have been struggling to see as many women as we had in the past. So what are risk factors and how can we maintain awareness of the potential vulnerabilities of trafficking? Risk factors include chronic homelessness, family or friends involved in commercial sex, truancy, LGBTQIA+, previous abuse, substance abuse, whether or not a victim is already present in the juvenile justice system, whether or not they're immigrants, or if they have present disabilities. And many of these risk factors show the need for early and community-based interventions. And that is something that we really focus on in prevention, education, and outreach. We really try to be that first line of defense that can kind of intercept youth where they're the most vulnerable and raise as much awareness as possible through prevention education. And that prevention education is not explicitly, what is human trafficking? How can we be safe? But we try to tailor it to their developmental stage. So we try to talk about what is a healthy relationship and what does abuse look like, not only on you, but what does it look like in your friends? And how can you tell when they may need help or when they may need an adult to intervene? So by using these kind of workaround topics and focusing on themes of healthy and stable relationships, we're able to make that early intervention without compromising the developmental stage that the youth might be in. So how can you take action in your communities? How can you raise awareness about human trafficking and combat it? You can do something as simple as attending this webinar right now. That's a huge step towards raising awareness and providing yourself with knowledge of things that you can do. You can send emails to your local representatives, sign petitions, make pledges, get involved with local organizations, whether that be through making donations to their mission or volunteering your time. And you can raise awareness. In the day of social media now, it's so easy to post something for the world to see. And I like to remind people that you have a choice in what you consume and what you post. So making it count is something that can go a long way. All it takes is for one person to share. How you can refer. If something in this presentation sticks out to you and you've noticed something, I always say it's better to be safe than sorry. So it's always better to refer, have someone look into it and confirm whether, something has gone awry or that there is an issue of trafficking, than to let it go unnoticed just because you're not sure. So I've listed 3 ways that you guys can refer. One is through our 24/7 crisis hotline. The number is featured there on the left. And like I said, that is the quickest way to receive help. Of course, in any instance of an emergency, you should dial for emergency services. In the middle is our website, and we have a referral form. It is the big red button on the top left of the webpage. Our website is www.fairgirls.org, and you can fill out that referral form. I do ask that you allow 24 to 48 hours before expecting a response, because it does take time for our direct services team to go through those referral forms. And finally, the National Human Trafficking Hotline is featured on the right, and that is also a 24/7 hotline that you can call from anywhere in the country and receive local services. And finally, I've left my contact information here for anyone who's interested to use. I'm always happy to answer any questions that you have related to human trafficking or Fair Girls as an organization. So again, I am the Prevention, Education, and Outreach Specialist, and I have left my email and phone number here. Thank you guys for your time.
Thank you, Kimberly, so much for your presentation and your very informative details about your organization and what it's doing to combat human trafficking. I'd like to invite Martina Vandenberg to give her presentation on her organization, the Human Trafficking Legal Center, and what they are doing to combat human trafficking.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Serena. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think you're going to share your screen. So while we're waiting for the deck to come up, so please go ahead and do, there we go. Perfect. The Human Trafficking Legal Center is based in Washington, D.C., but we work both nationally and globally. So next slide. And this wheel sort of gives a sense of the breadth and depth of the services that we offer. So the first is pro bono referrals. In Kimberly's excellent presentation, she talked about trafficking survivors needing to have a better future. And one way to do that is through legal services. And so we have trained more than 4,000 lawyers in the United States to handle cases pro bono, which means entirely free. Once a pro bono lawyer has taken on a case, we'll mentor that lawyer. We also do extensive research on human trafficking. We have databases of every civil trafficking case and every criminal trafficking case filed at the federal level in the United States. And we mine that data to try and identify trends, but also to identify system failures where the law is not being implemented properly or effectively. And I'll talk about some of those failures later in this presentation. We also do strategic litigation, which means we bring cases in order to change policy. So cases that are bigger than just one trafficking survivor, cases that are designed to create disincentives for corporations, for example, to engage in forced labor, or disincentives for diplomats in the United States to traffic domestic workers into forced labor, which is something we work on quite a lot. And then we do training. So training like this one, much of the training that we do focuses on lawyers. I'm a lawyer and I've worked in the human trafficking field for more than 20 years. And so in that time, we've identified some significant needs for trafficking survivors who desperately need help navigating their way through the courts. So what kind of pro bono assistance do trafficking survivors need? One is criminal victim witness representation, because if you're going to court to be a witness, you need a lawyer. Criminal restitution, which is money in a criminal case to a victim from a defendant to make them whole after the victimization that they've suffered. Criminal restitution is mandatory in the United States. And for those of you who are familiar with the Palermo Protocol on trafficking, the UN protocol, The Palermo Protocol also says that trafficking survivors should be compensated in Article 6 of that convention. We do civil litigation, which means trafficking survivors bring cases on their own in the courts in order to win damages, so financial damages from the traffickers. We do immigration cases. Those are T visas. In the United States, you can get a special visa if you're a survivor of human trafficking called a T visa to remain in the United States for 3 years. That can then translate into a green card and then later citizenship. Vacatur, we already talked about. Kimberly mentioned this in her presentation. Vacatur is essentially removing criminal prosecutions, removing criminal convictions from the records of trafficking survivors who committed the crimes at the behest of their traffickers and were forced to commit crimes and then unjustly prosecuted for them and convicted for them. So it's to wipe their criminal records free. Tax controversies. Why? Because traffickers often steal the identity of their victims and borrow money, file false tax returns. And so tax lawyers are very important in our work. And then there's sort of the bips and bobs, the name changes, the family law, the landlord-tenant issues. And then we also have lawyers do research. So that's a kind of buffet of the pro bono activities that we do. Next slide, please. I wanted to spend our time today actually talking about some of the cases that we've seen in the United States, because I think it's very important to understand that trafficking, as Kimberly mentioned, goes way beyond sex trafficking. That may be what you see in the movie Taken, and it may be what you read in the papers, but labor trafficking is actually a majority of trafficking in the world. This is a particularly troubling case where a wealthy couple living in this mansion in South Lake, Texas, trafficked a child in 2000 from Guinea. They came from wealthy families in Guinea. They trafficked this child and held her in their home as a house slave for 16 years. They paid her nothing. She was physically, emotionally, and verbally abused. She came in order to be their nanny. She took care of all the children, did all the cooking, did all the cleaning in this large house. And it wasn't until a neighbor intervened that they identified that she was a trafficking victim. And this case went to trial. The defendants were prosecuted and sentenced to 7 years. But from my perspective, much more important, the child, now an adult, was awarded hundreds of thousands of dollars in restitution for the back wages that the defendants never paid her when she was employed in their home. Next slide. This is another domestic servitude case. As I mentioned, we see a lot of cases involving domestic workers in the United States, and domestic worker cases are a large percentage of the cases that we see around the globe. This is actually a case of a woman from China who brought a domestic worker from China and held her in Minnesota, not exactly a place that we consider a hub of human trafficking. She was held in Minnesota. This victim was only identified when she decided she could no longer survive in that home and decided to walk to the airport by watching which way the planes were flying to see if she could find the airport to fly back to China. Now, again, from my perspective, important that the defendant, who committed also severe physical violence against this particular trafficking victim she held in her home as a victim of forced labor, not only did the defendant actually get prison time, the victim in this case was ordered $123,000 in restitution for all the back wages that she was owed. Next slide, please. Restitution is not just a feature of criminal forced labor cases, it's also a feature of criminal sex trafficking cases. So this is a particular case in Florida where a man was sentenced to 40 years in prison, but also ordered to pay $1.1 million in restitution to the trafficking victims. So why am I focusing so much on restitution and compensation? It's because in my 25 years of working on human trafficking, I have learned that trafficking survivors need immigration assistance, they need psychological assistance, they need all kinds of wraparound support, they need case management, but really, at bottom, what they really need is money. And the system should work so that trafficking victims can get compensation. Next slide, please. So we wrote a report. I know HREA puts materials on their website, so I hope that you will add this to your list. This is a report that we actually did with one of the pro bono law firms, tracking whether or not courts are ordering restitution to trafficking victims in forced labor and sex trafficking cases in the United States. And unfortunately, the answer that we reached was no. And the percentage of cases that end in a restitution order is very low, about 27%. That is a huge system failure that we are seeking to remedy by advocating both in Congress and then also advocating with the Department of Justice to make sure not just that restitution is ordered, but that restitution orders are enforced and paid. The only thing worse than not getting any restitution in a criminal case is getting a restitution order that the defendant never pays. So next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that we also work on civil litigation, and civil cases are very important for trafficking survivors, and particularly important for trafficking survivors held in forced labor who almost never see their cases prosecuted. Last year in the entire United States, there were 15 labor trafficking prosecutions in the entire country brought by the federal authorities. Worldwide, there were only 337 convictions for forced labor in the entire world. So this method that we have developed over the last 20 years of bringing lawsuits in the civil cases to get justice for trafficking survivors, for some is the only path to justice that they'll ever see. Next slide, please. So what kinds of cases are going to court? I just have a few examples that I want to share with you because I think they give a sort of sense of the range of cases. It can be sex trafficking cases or labor trafficking cases. This is a labor trafficking case. This is actually an article that I clipped from the New York Times. This is a case of a child who was trafficked by a cult in the United States. She was held in forced labor for more than a decade, and she was transported from state to state to state. She was put in forced labor in bakeries, in restaurants, all owned by this organization. She took her case to court with a team of brilliant pro bono lawyers, and she won $8 million in that case. Now, again, collection is always a different story, but even winning the verdict is a significant victory. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, these cases can be forced labor or sex trafficking, or this one, both. So this was a human trafficking case in which the trafficker took the victim into a hotel and held her hostage in a hotel while he prepared to traffic her into the sex industry. She escaped before he could traffic her into the commercial sex industry. She was held in forced labor in that hotel room. One of the things that we've managed to do in our cases is convince the courts that sexual servitude of a non-commercial nature is actually involuntary servitude. It's a form of forced labor. So in this particular case, the victim had a wonderful team of pro bono lawyers. They went to trial in Boston. She testified in the case. And that very day, the hotels settled. So the settlement is confidential, but it's an example of a trafficking survivor who suffered both forced labor and attempted sex trafficking, going to court against the hotel where she was held captive as a third-party beneficiary of the trafficking. Next slide, please. One of the areas that we work on quite a lot is diplomats, because diplomats can bring domestic workers into capitals all around the globe using special visas. It's guaranteed under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. When those diplomats bring the domestic workers into their homes, in the United States, the domestic workers are tied to their employers by their visa. The visa has the diplomat employer's name in it. It's a kind of American kafala system for those who are familiar with kafala in the Middle East. But it's not just foreign diplomats bringing trafficking victims for forced labor and domestic servitude into the United States. We also have cases of American diplomats abroad who have taken domestic workers with them or hired people locally and held them in forced labor. This is a case of an American diplomat who was married to an Australian retired diplomat. They did this not once, but twice, at least. They brought in a domestic worker into their home in Yemen. This is a picture of Yemen. The wife was employed by the US Embassy in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. And while she was at work every day, the husband stayed home, held the domestic worker in forced labor and also sexual servitude. This case went to trial before a jury in the Eastern District of Virginia, and the jury awarded this victim $3 million. The scary thing about this case, however, is that it was never criminally prosecuted. which is troubling. Next slide. So that's the full presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Our website is on the screen, www.htlegalcenter.org. And we have a publications page on the website that has a host of materials that I hope you will find useful. Most of them are guides. A lot of them are legal guides for lawyers, but then a lot of them are research documents showing real system failures here in the United States that still need to be remedied. So thank you for spending the World Day Against Trafficking with us. And thank you so much to HREA for inviting us to speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martina, for that presentation. I've learned so much from it, and I'm sure others have as well. And it's very jarring to hear some of these cases, but thank you so much for sharing them. I'd like to open the floor now for a Q&A session. So please, participants, please do feel free to either raise your hand and ask a question or just type them in the chat box, and I can read them out for you.
There's a question in the chat box, Serena. Maybe you can read it, from Dominique.
Sure. So I think Dominic has asked if your organizations have refugees or undocumented migrants in human trafficking and what you do for them.
So that's a great question. And many of the clients that we serve as lawyers, by the time they come to us, they're undocumented. But most of our clients come into the United States completely legally. They come in with visas. They think they're going to have wonderful jobs. They think that they're going to be able to earn money and send it home to their families, which is why they came here in the first place. And sadly, when they arrive, they discover that their visa status is tied to the employer. And if they're trafficked and if they run away, they're out of status. So by the time people come to us, they are out of status by virtue of the fact that they've left their employers. And so what we do, Dominic, in a case like that is we file for what's called a T visa. That T visa requires us just to put essentially an application in. There's no fee for the application, and we apply for essentially legal immigration status with this visa for trafficking survivors. And some of the happiest moments of my life as a human trafficking, human rights lawyer are welcoming children to the United States. Some of our clients who've been in domestic servitude haven't seen their children in 10 years. And so we bring those children to the United States. We get them derivative visas to come to the United States, and then we go to the airport. And those reunions are so beautiful, and they really make all of this work worthwhile.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any follow-up questions for either one of our presenters?
Could I just acknowledge that there's an amazing leader in the room. Jose Alfaro is also attending today. And Jose, if you don't mind, may I just say a few words about you? I can't hear Jose, but I just want to mention that Jose is a leader in the anti-trafficking world and is writing a book currently about his experiences as a trafficking survivor held in forced prostitution as a child in the United States. So it's wonderful to see Jose in the room today. Thank you for coming, Jose.
Hi, Martina. So sorry. I was looking for the unmute button. I'm on my phone. But yes, thank you so much for introducing me. And I loved your presentation. I'm so happy to be here and just listen. So thank you.
Thanks, Jose.
Can I just ask a particular question? When you have these cases with diplomats and them kind of exploiting the special status that they have, how do you think that needs to kind of be addressed in a different way to be more effective against people who have that kind of special status over other people?
So Serena, that's such a good question. So one of the things that we have advocated is that when a diplomat traffics a domestic worker, and when we get a judgment against that diplomat, so for example, there's a $1 million judgment currently pending against a diplomat from Malawi who went back to Malawi and was promoted. It's not that they were punished, she was promoted by her government and still has refused to pay. In a case like that, we have pushed very hard for the government of the diplomat's sending state to pay. It's called an ex gratia payment. And so we fight very hard to get compensation, oftentimes from the countries themselves. But in terms of prevention, because I know you're focused on prevention, one of the changes that we could make is literally untying those visas, right? Unbundling those visas, making it possible for domestic workers to move to a different employer if the current employer is trafficking them. One of the things that we advocated for and succeeded was check-in meetings. So now the State Department and also foreign ministries across the globe will do meetings with domestic workers who are brought here by diplomats periodically, just to make sure that they're safe. And so the diplomat's domestic worker and the official from the Department of State or whatever Ministry of Foreign Affairs it might be will have a conversation. And that conversation goes something like this: do you have your passport? Right? Someone just asked in the chat whether it's legal to take away someone's passport. The answer is no. So the domestic worker who works for the diplomat is asked by the official from the US government, do you have your passport? Do you have a phone? Are you able to leave the house? Are you getting paid? Show me your bank statement to prove that you're getting paid. I mean, one of the things that we've seen here is that the diplomats get increasingly tricky. And so you'll have diplomats pay someone in a bank account and then immediately demand a cash kickback. So in reality, they're not being paid at all. You get $1,000 in your bank account, and then you immediately give $1,000 in cash back to your employer. So there are tricky ways, sly ways to get around these rules, and sly ways to try and game the system. But we are working very hard with survivors to try and identify what happens in order to prevent that kind of harm.
Thank you. I think that makes a lot of sense. And all the focus on restitution, I think that's a good focus to have, and that it makes a lot of sense. I'd like to ask this question posed to both you and Kimberly about how you both think education and training of the public, but also survivors, how that can contribute to addressing and combating this human rights challenge and violation.
Kimberly, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can go first. Thank you, Martina. I think it's incredibly important, given the certain taboo stigma associated with trafficking and being a survivor of these types of crimes. I think there is a lot of stereotypes associated with it in terms of race and gender, and even sexual orientation, and who is victimized and who perpetrates these crimes. So when conducting prevention education and other trainings, I really like to focus on cultural competency and being as trauma-informed as possible in order to negate those stigmas associated with survivor stories and what it really means to be a survivor re-entering society. So that way we can motivate survivors to be more open and share their experiences, because in order to make change from not only a policy perspective, but also in terms of mental health services and best practices, legal services and legal best practices, it's really important to have that survivor input. And I think that prevention education and raising as much awareness as possible allows survivors to feel free enough to share those stories and share those necessary inputs.
So I would just agree with everything that Kimberly said, and I would just add one thing. There's an organization called the Survivor Alliance, and the Survivor Alliance is holding a World Congress this week. In fact, they're having meetings today. And the Survivor Alliance is essentially an international organization that brings survivors of forced labor and sex trafficking together to talk about what the trafficking movement should look like in the next 10 years. So survivors have called out racism in the movement. Survivors have called out essentially what they call the circular firing squad of services, where one NGO will receive a call, and then they'll refer the victim to someone else, and then that NGO will refer the victim to someone else, and then finally at the end of the day, the victim gets referred back to the first NGO it called, and the victim hasn't gotten any assistance at all. So survivors are so important to call out what's not working because they see it firsthand. The other major change that's happening, Serena, is we're seeing more and more survivors who are entering the movement as professionals. So survivors who are lawyers, survivors who are executive directors, survivors who are leading the movement. And so I think that's a major trend that I would identify.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. I think great points were made on really focusing on survivors and their experience and really empowering them. I'd like to now go ahead and just briefly share some of the resources that we have on our online resource center. I'm just going to share my screen for a little bit. Sorry, can I just confirm that everyone can see my screen? Yeah? No?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so this is our resource center that we have on our website. Our online resource center it does what it sounds like it does. It's our online repository and curated database of human rights education and training materials that HREA has built. Our purpose in having this is to facilitate access to all these relevant materials and educational resources. So on our online resource center, you can search for resources in two ways. The first being by human rights theme. So if you click on that, you will be redirected to this page where we have all these keywords for relevant themes where we have curated resources for. So for example, I'm just going to click on human trafficking, and you can see that we have 32 resources on human trafficking. And once you click on that, if you scroll down below, you'll see all the relevant resources that we have. And we have a really large variety of them, and I'll go over that in just a bit. The second way you can search for resources on our online resource center is by target group and human rights education strategy. So as you can see here, there are groups like formal education, we have multimedia and arts, non-formal education, training of professional groups. So for example, if you click on formal education, you can then click on subcategories that we have in formal education, such as, for example, higher education, and that will really narrow down your results to the ones that are obviously relevant to these categories that you've selected. And so if you know specifically what you are looking for and in what medium, then it can really help you narrow down the search results in that way. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of some examples that we have of the variety of and range of resources that we have regarding human trafficking. First being this formal education resource. It's for secondary education, and it is by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. So we have the URL linked here, and again, you can see the different target groups and subcategories that it's cataloged under. And so if you go to the link, this is the resource that's being linked here. And it is basically a guide for teachers to teach human trafficking in their classrooms for secondary school students. So it has this main video that's been created, and the guide is split into 4 modules to kind of talk the teacher through how to use this video and highlight some accompanying materials that teachers can use to effectively teach students using this video. So for example, in module 3, it will show teachers how to use this video to teach students. So it kind of highlights the importance of defining the purpose and setting expectations for students so that they know what the exact purpose of showing this video is and what points to kind of keep in mind while watching the video. It offers materials such as discussion guide to help set those ideas in mind and for students to have that kind of mindset. In the next module, it offers all of these post-viewing activities that teachers can distribute to students. So a lot of lesson plans and different ideas for activities. If you go to resources, again, it gives so many different resources on different activity sheets, discussion guides and glossaries, as well as checklists and sample templates of diagrams for students to use to really get everything out of this video. So that's an example of how there are some materials for teachers to use to teach students in secondary school. Another quick example in formal education, it's a different medium. So previously we looked at a video, and this is a different form. Again, we have a file link here, which you can use to download these materials. But this is a comic book that has been developed by the Council of Europe. And it's an interesting medium because it really reaches more students in a way by telling stories of these characters of men and women and children who have been trafficked. And it's more accessible in a way, in a more accessible format, if you will, for some students who are particularly into reading comics. It can, I think, generate more interest in educational materials for students in that sense. We also have other guides that aren't necessarily teaching materials, but for students to kind of use to educate themselves and generate awareness in their own communities. So for example, this is a student toolkit that's been developed by the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. And it's basically like a handbook on how to engage yourself, people around you on your campus to kind of raise awareness for human trafficking and human trafficking in that sense. For example, here you can see there's a chapter on the 10 ways to raise awareness of human trafficking in the hotline. And it goes through a variety of ideas, such as distributing posters and flyers about it and hosting a movie screening of documentaries or other films that seek to raise awareness about the issue, and creating a listserv and so on and so forth. And so there are really huge range of resources. The next one I have over here it's a different medium. It's in the group Multimedia and Arts, and it's basically a webinar series that's been established by this group called the Global Center for Women and Justice, and it's called Ending Human Trafficking. And it's a really great webinar, podcast series. And yeah, as you can see, there are so many different episodes that have a different focus. For example, this one, there's a specific focus on how to work with law enforcement, and they bring in different specialists and different invited speakers to kind of just raise awareness and for people who are listening to the podcast to kind of engage in the issues and do what they can as individuals to educate themselves and educate those around them. So these are all just examples of some of the resources that we have. I'm just gonna stop sharing my screen now. But yeah, thank you everyone so much for attending this webinar, and to the speakers, especially Martina and Kimberly, thank you so much for all your wonderful and insightful presentations that have been so informative and educational. We really do appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today, and also obviously to the participants for coming to listen to all these presentations and wonderful speakers. Thank you to everyone so much again, and please do go check out all of our respective organizations and keep learning about and engaging in issues such as these. Thank you. Take care.